My name is Yousef Munayyer. I am head of the Israel-Palestine Program and Senior Fellow at Arab Center, Washington, D.C. Before introducing our keynote speaker, I would like to encourage you all, as previous panel chairs have, to participate in our Q&A session using the Q&A cards on the tables in front of you, the Q&A feature on Zoom, or by emailing your questions to events@arabcenterdc.org. I'm delighted to host this keynote conversation with Dr. Hanan Ashrawi, who hardly needs an introduction. Dr. Ashrawi is a former member of the Palestinian National Council and was elected to the Palestinian Legislative Council in 2006. In 2009, she was elected as a member of the PLO Executive Committee and heads the Department of Culture and Information. She has founded numerous bodies and institutions, most importantly, the Independent Commission for Human Rights, the Palestinian Initiative for the Promotion of Global Dialogue and Democracy, or Miftah, and the Coalition for Accountability and Integrity. Dr. Ashrawi is also a member of advisory bodies for several institutions, including the Institute for Palestine Studies and the International Human Rights Commission. She holds many honorary degrees, including local and international awards in the field of women's issues, peacemaking, international affairs, human rights, and higher education. She's authored poems, short stories, papers, articles on culture, literature, and Palestinian politics. Dr. Ashrawi holds a bachelor's and master's degree from the American University of Beirut and a doctoral degree from Birzeit University, where she continued to, from the University of Virginia. And she served as dean of the faculty of Birzeit University and continued to teach until 1995. She also established and headed Birzeit University's Page 5 of 9 Legal Aid Committee and served as Palestinian Authority Minister for Higher Education and Scientific Research from 1996 to 1998. Hanan, it's so good to have you with us.
Thank you, Yousef. It's great to be with you, and thank you for the invitation, Khalil and the Arab Center.
Well, we want to make the most of our time with you, and I know there are many questions. I want to start with this by asking you to tell us a little bit about the current situation in Palestine. Living in Palestine over the years, you've seen your share of right-wing Israeli governments and politicians, from people like Begin and Shamir to now Smotrich and Ben-Gvir. What's most different about life for Palestinians since this new far-right government in Israel was formed, and how are these things manifesting in daily life?
Yes, thank you for the question. Clearly, what we're seeing is not something new, but what we're seeing is the trajectory of violations of human rights, of targeting Palestinians, of expansion of settlements, stealing more land and more resources, extrajudicial executions, and so on. This trajectory has escalated and has intensified. And what's happened in Israel is that this policy that has been hidden or has been disguised, and Israel apologists always described it as the only democracy in the region or as our strategic ally. We share values, Judeo-Christian values, and so on. All these things now ring hollow because it's come out in the open. This government is insisting on really exposing what has been happening, but in an intensified and clear manner, to the point where it's clear that the Greater Israel plan is being implemented on the ground, and where extremist right-wing a theocracy or fascist system is emerging now, and it is clear to everybody. The end of the myth of democratic Israel and the Western Israel is now in sight, and Israel is imploding from within. But it's Palestine that's paying the price. The Palestinian people, of course, are subject to the most horrific violence. It's violence, it's racism, it's total dehumanization, targeting everything. I mean, daily, the settlers are on the rampage, they terrorize people. Israel has intensified its house demolitions, its extrajudicial executions. It is building settlements and increasing settlers. When we started the talks, we had 115,000 settlers. Now there are 750,000 settlers in the West Bank. So clearly the annexation formula and plan is being implemented unapologetically, in an unabashed manner. There you are, there you see, this is Israel. It kills with impunity. It enjoys its protection from the West. It acts outside the law. It violates every agreement and of course, international law and international humanitarian law, and it gets away with it. And the Palestinians feel extremely vulnerable and unprotected. They feel that they're suffering multiple injustices. We can talk about that later, but very clearly, I call this the end of an era, the end of an era of the myth of Israel as a democracy, as the racist statement, a villa in the jungle, that this has come to an end. And Israel is clearly being seen for what it is, an apartheid state, a settler colonial state, and a state that targets Palestinians with impunity again. While in Palestine, the end of an era where people thought that all you need to do is be nice, is accept advice or pressure from the US and the West, that a negotiated settlement or agreement is in the making or is possible. Now people are beginning to see that not only is this a dead end, but it is extremely detrimental to Palestinian rights because it provides Israel with cover. And of course, it provides the West with the excuse that we are for the two-state solution. All we need is to have negotiations between the parties and God's in his heaven and all's well with the world. This isn't happening. This so-called peace process has in many ways emboldened, empowered, and enabled Israel, and has contributed to the, I don't want to say weakening, but to the further victimization of the Palestinian people. So we are, again, at the end of an era. People are looking for alternatives, for solutions, whether in terms of leaderships or whether in terms of political agendas and programs.
I'd like to ask you a little bit about how we arrived at this juncture that you call the end of an era, and I think I agree with you here. 30 years ago this month, there was quite a ceremony here in Washington, just down the street at the White House Rose Garden between Israel and the PLO. Can you take us back to that day and tell us about what apprehensions and concerns you had with the process that was about to kick off? And if you could go back in time now and send a message to yourself or even to Abu Ammar or Abu Mazen before the signing, what's one thing you would warn them about given what you've seen transpire?
Yeah. Well, actually, I had serious reservations and genuine concerns about the signing of the agreement itself. In many ways, all the problems with the agreement have come to a head, whether it is in terms of the context or in terms of the text itself and the content, whether it's in terms of the players, or even in terms of structure and process. Everything was flawed at that time. And all the flaws, all the problems have developed over time and in many ways became exaggerated. But at that time, and I told Yasser Arafat, I was quite apprehensive, and I told them that this agreement could lead to disaster, that it had all these flaws and it had to be addressed very seriously. It entrenches the occupation, empowers the occupier at the expense of the occupied, and so on. I have many, we can talk about that later. But I really thought that maybe if we empower the Palestinians, if we really try to build our institutions and a system of good governance, if we try to help and support Palestinian resilience and our ability to stay on the ground and to stand up to Israeli aggressions and oppression and so on, that this could be a new era. But clearly, it wasn't. It was just, as I said, a further escalation in terms of the power of the occupier and the lawlessness and criminality of this occupation. Now, if I told the Yasser Arafat several things. One of them was not to sign the mutual recognition document, which I first saw only in Washington just before the signing ceremony. I was quite upset because it recognized Israel's right to exist within safe and secure borders. And in exchange, Rabin recognized the PLO as a representative of the Palestinian people. So I said, clearly, we need to have a recognition of the Palestinian people's right to self-determination, to sovereignty, to freedom on our own land. And if we don't get that, the only thing you got was a recognition of an organization which we built. And it says nothing in terms of self-determination and all our rights as a nation. He was quite convinced that no, the PLO represents a Palestinian identity and history and therefore stands for self-determination. But clearly it wasn't the case. So that's one thing. But now I probably would tell them not to sign anything. I mean, I tried before and I tried to change the agreement when I saw it. I was unable to because it was already initialed the first time I had seen it. Probably with hindsight, I would have worked harder to try to prevent the signature, frankly. I left the negotiations right after the signature and I never joined again because I was seriously worried about where this was going in terms also of the players and participants.
I do want to ask you a little bit about the PLO. One thing that the Oslo Accords did succeed in doing was bringing the leadership of the PLO back into Palestine, establishing the Palestinian National Authority. And for many today who are watching from the outside, and indeed from inside Palestine as well, the Palestinian Authority has become something of a burden on Palestinians. This is something we're seeing evidence of repeated in public opinion polls. Yeah. You are someone who was living, of course, in the occupied West Bank before the Palestinian Authority and continues to now, and you're someone who's been involved in the PLO's decision-making bodies for years. Can you give us your assessment of where the Palestinian Authority stands today as a vehicle for Palestinian liberation? And you've also been an advocate for democracy and human rights consistently. We know, of course, the impact of apartheid and occupation on these things. But what has Oslo meant for democracy and human rights under the Palestinian Authority as well?
Well, the first part of your question dealt with the PLO and what happened to it. And it's ironic that one major impetus, one major motivation for the PLO to join the peace process and to sign the Declaration of Independence in Washington was to rescue the PLO because it was at its weakest, it was going bankrupt, it was expelled from Lebanon, it was in Tunis and dispersed all over. So the PLO saw that this is one way in which it can regain legitimacy and recognition. And therefore, one major driving force was that, to rescue the PLO. And we, as negotiators at that time, wanted to rescue the PLO, because to us, it was really the body that represented all Palestinians everywhere. And it did signal our history of struggle. We had undergone a revolution. We were, in many ways, we had saved the Palestinian national identity and so on. And ironically, it was the signing of the BOP and the subsequent agreements in what is called the Oslo process that weakened the PLO, the creation of the PNA or PA, in many ways, rather than being the arm of the PLO, the administrative arm, functional arm to build institutions and provide services to the people, it took over. It became the primary power. The Americans at that time wanted to get rid of the PLO, and also Europeans. We were told not even to mention the PLO, let alone to recognize the PLO as or to belong to the PLO. So it went from being the target for dissolution, let's say, or destruction, to being a negotiating partner, and then to being to coming back to Palestine and to setting up the PNA and the system itself, which was inherently a functional system and not a system that meant sovereignty or sovereign control over the land or the people. So the PA gradually took over the powers of the PLO, and it was weakened in many ways, which many governments in the West were happy to see, because they didn't want to see the PLO and what it represented in terms of our political representation and national identity, and they were quite happy with a functional system of government, institutions, and so on, to take over the running of people's lives daily, and so on. So that's what happened. It's very ironic that the PLO was subsumed by the PNA or PA. And the PA now is addressed as though it is the political address and the government, when it's not, but the PLO is. But now the PLO is so weak, it's almost disappeared from the political screen. It is there as a pro forma thing, which is why I resigned from the PLO executive. One reason, among others. The second part of your question deals with the PNA and where is it now, or
with what the impact of the Oslo period was on democracy and human rights within the country.
Democracy and human rights, exactly. Yes, I mean, there is an irony there, because for years, again, we've been saying that Israel is no democracy, that we were living under a system of oppression and subjugation that is entirely living existing without any kind of accountability, fully enjoying its immunity, acting with impunity, violating the laws, and so on. And then we were told that we had to build a democracy. That's fine. We built a democracy even under direct occupation. Remember, we were not allowed to have elections. And I know that elections are not the only requirement for democracy, but under occupation, we weren't allowed to have elections, even for trade unions or professional unions, and so on. And at the same time, when we had elections in '76, well, once the PLO representatives won, and the notables or the supporters of Israel lost, and so Israel said no more elections, that's it. And of course, there were attempts at the assassination of our elected local government officials and mayors. So to us, building democratic institutions and elections and having serious legislation that is actually the basis of a rule of law within Palestine was crucial to us, because we didn't have any of these things. And we tried very hard to maintain such a system. Unfortunately, when the PNA was established, gradually, and with Israeli oppression increasing, Israeli land theft increasing, and violations, and with Israel continuing to control all our land, our resources, our airspace, territorial waters, entry and exit spaces, everything was under Israeli control, and it gave itself the right to do whatever it wanted. So under such an abnormal situation, we were expected to build a normal democracy. And I would say you cannot reconcile democracy with occupation, because what you're seeing in front of you is a totally oppressive, undemocratic military system of oppression. And what you're supposed to do under that system of captivity and oppression, build your own healthy and normal institutions. I'm not justifying our shortcomings, but I'm telling you how the world's expectations are so warped in many ways. When we had elections and when Hamas won the majority seats, immediately all those people who were talking about building institutions, transparency, accountability, democracy, etc., forgot all their ideas and boycotted Palestine and boycotted our institutions. And that sent a clear message to the Palestinians that if we like democracy, provided you elect the people we want, and that some people deserve democracy more than others. We were saying, look, Israel has been violating the law, has been clearly even violating its agreements, even with you, whether it's the EU and the association agreements and so on, or the Americans and their position on settlements, and it gets away with it. Now we elect our own representatives, and Hamas ended up having majority seats. Suddenly we all are, placed under sanctions. We are boycotted. Our institutions are denied and so on. Our system is unacceptable. We all became terrorists again. So that type of double standards and hypocrisy did in many ways resonate with people. But the worst thing is that the PA and the political system as a whole has come under siege in many ways. And people are suffering without getting any protection from their own leadership, from their own security systems. And that weakened the political system gradually, and it increased the gap between the people and the leadership. And the weaker the leadership is, the more closed it becomes, the more possessive of its powers it becomes, the more insecure it becomes, especially when it deals with its own people or alternatives from within civil society, or attempts at having elections and changing the leadership and having genuine internal accountability and oversight. And then gradually the PLC, which is the Legislative Council, it was disbanded because it expired, and it was elected actually at the same time or just after the election, just before the election of the president. So the PLC expired and there was no oversight, no legislative body. And then there was a shrinkage, both in terms of space, of civil freedom, of civil rights, of freedoms and rights, freedom of expression, political organization, and so on. And at the same time, a shrinkage in terms of the system of decision-making and power. It shrank till it became concentrated in the hands of a few. The institutions, including not just the legislative body, but also the judiciary, was targeted. And we ended up seeing one executive branch subsuming all powers and responsibilities, I assume, of legislation and of judiciary and judicial action. So the more that happens, the more people feel that they are subject to a closed system that is oppressive. And the more they want change, the more disappointed they are when they are denied the right to change or the right to hold their own leaders accountable. And that, in a sense, has led to a serious sense of disappointment, particularly after the cancellation or delay of the elections in 2021, which told people that you have no say in your own lives. And at the same time, we see laws being passed, bills being promulgated without the proper procedure, and quite often targeting these freedoms and civil society and individuals and political activists. As a result, you are seeing this gap between people and leaders, but you are also seeing the emergence of a younger generation. And it is not all monolithic, of course, but a younger generation that does not believe either in the negotiated process or the Oslo process, which I see as being absolutely negative. They want part of it, they are only suffering the consequences. You are seeing people who are saying, we don't want to talk about one state, two states, we just want our rights and our freedom. And you are seeing people who say that if you won't protect us, we will take up arms and protect ourselves and our villages and the refugee camps and towns, particularly given the fact that there is a real escalation in terms of violence and outright terror being exercised against the people with no protection. They see their security forces, but Palestinian security cannot protect their own people. So the human rights situation has deteriorated. The democratic aspirations have been totally abandoned, I would say, not by the people, by the leadership. And all the abnormalities of the occupation have tainted our own domestic realities. So we do need serious intervention. There are many attempts at trying to formulate new institutions, trying to formulate a new political agenda, and to bring out new leadership. But clearly, without elections, it's going to be very difficult. And we know that Israel interferes in elections in every possible way. After all, we live in a state of siege and fragmentation. And even the two bouts of elections that we had before were not very free because there were checkpoints, there was intimidation. I personally, as you know, was stopped at the checkpoint. I was running for Jerusalem. I was beaten up and they took away my materials, my elections posters and leaflets and so on. And I was held at the checkpoint for a whole day. But the next day I made a point because to us elections are a form of struggle, are a form of defiance. And we did have elections in spite of that. Now there is the saying that without Jerusalem, there are no elections. But what we have to say is that there will be elections and we will have them in Jerusalem. And it is part of the struggle to have elections in Jerusalem. And we will make sure that we do.
Thank you for that, Dr. Ashrawi. I want to move to audience Q&A in a moment, so please do send your questions in if you have them, and I will see them here either through the Zoom or pass up the question cards. But I want to ask you one last question from myself. There is a lot changing right now. You talked about the end of an era. Several Arab states have also moved towards normalization with Israel. The Israeli-Palestinian peace process is an afterthought. Abu Mazen is approaching 90 years old, and it seems that every few months, new groups of young Palestinian fighters are forming and confronting the Israeli occupation and exposing limits in the Palestinian Authority's control. Are we on the precipice of something significant? Do you see the struggle for Palestinian freedom shifting to a new era if this era is ending? What do you think it will look like, and what is your advice for a younger generation of Palestinians today?
Well, first, the normalization. And to us, this again is an unacceptable term because what you're normalizing is occupation and oppression and criminality and lawlessness and rewarding Israel as we see it as a rogue state. And marginalizing the Palestinian issue and weakening the Palestinians even further, dividing the Arab position, Arab countries vertically and horizontally in terms of creating a rift between the people and their leadership. And of course, among states themselves, the Arab League initiative of the peace initiative is standing on its head now. Normalization or recognition before withdrawal, when withdrawal was the prerequisite for recognition and normalization. Anyway, look, the whole region is still in a post-colonial stage. Clearly, Israel is a colonial outpost, and it is acting clearly as a settler colonial state. And if I say so, many people get upset. Israel is an artificial construct. We don't see it as an organic reality that emerged with the continuity and so on. We see it as a construct that was imposed on Palestine, creating Palestine. And now there are attempts, and this became a real focus of American foreign policy in the region. How do we normalize the Arab world with Israel? How do we not only normalize, but integrate Israel in the Arab world? In order to gain, of course, legitimacy, recognition, and ties, and so on? How do we reposition Israel to become a major political, military, economic, intelligence power in the region? And all these things have led to a situation where Israel is not only emboldened, as I said, it is rewarded. And the Arab world is in disarray, reinventing enemies and allies, trying to present Israel as an ally of the so-called moderate Arab regimes. All these things have only enabled the more autocratic regimes And the US and Israel, the US in particular, exploited the weaknesses of certain Arab regimes and used a double system of blackmail and pressure and rewards, bribes, I call it blackmail and bribes, in order to desperately gain recognition and normalization for Israel. And now they're trying to do this with Saudi Arabia, saying that this is the great, while Israel is in the grip of a very fascist, bloodthirsty, ethnocentric theocracy that is defying the whole world. And yet there's a mad rush, an obsessive approach to normalizing with Israel. And I think that there are Arabs who are beyond, I would say, bribery and blackmail, and who act on principle and who understand the Palestinian question as a very emotive core question of conscience, also among their own peoples. And I don't know how far they can go in defying their own people's feelings and sentiment. Now, that's one thing dealing with the normalization, but how far it can go, I mean, the new era, where are we going? I think, frankly, that we are in a state of flux. I'm sure you've had several discussions in the morning, and we'll be having more in the afternoon. But the whole region, if not the whole world, is undergoing a transformation. And all periods of transformation and all periods of transition are by nature unstable. And we're seeing the increase in dictatorships and the swing to the right, and as we said, ethnocentricities, the use of violence as a means of achieving ends, and the whole double standard of the world has been exposed. So we can talk about the world as a whole, but even when you talk about the region, we are directly impacted in the question of the Ukraine, for example, and the speed with which the ICC acted and with which the international community immediately mobilized and helped and defended and poured money and weapons and so on, while the Palestinians are languishing under this occupation without any kind of protection, while Israel is entirely held beyond accountability. So that is sending a very strange message. Now, the US is desperate because it is seeing that China is making moves in the region, that there are other types of alliances, or let's say rapprochement taking place in the region. And whether it's China, whether it's Russia, whether it's Iran, or whether it's somebody else, that this is no longer an American monopoly the way it saw it before. And that American control and power, which in many ways undermined democracy in the Arab world. It really did, and continued to ally with dictatorships and with autocratic systems. So this American monopoly that distorted the whole region and waged wars. Look at what happened to Iraq. Look at what's happening in Yemen. Look at what happened to Syria. Look what happened to Libya. These Arab countries did not sort of implode by themselves. There are several proxy wars taking place on their land, but again, that's another topic. So the region is in a state of flux. The monopoly control, what we call the monopolar world, is no longer there. There are several emerging powers. There are several different alliances, and within Palestine, there are different political groupings and ideas, and many of them are quite worth looking at and dealing with. While the Arab world, again, is still in a state of disarray. It has been weakened. And unless it uses its own internal power, its own resources, and it relies democratically on its own people as a source of legitimacy, not on external powers or alliances as a source of legitimacy, then they can rise up again.
Thank you very much for that, Dr. Ashrawi. Indeed, these are some of the themes that we've been talking about throughout this day, and you've hit on a number of them again. And thank you for updating us on the situation in Palestine, and to our audience for sending in questions. Unfortunately, we are out of time for this part of our agenda for today. And thank you again, Dr. Ashrawi, for your time and the conversation. Please stay with us for our next panel, which will begin immediately. And for that, I will turn over the stage to my colleague, Tamara Kharoub, who will chair the next session. Thank you again, Dr. Ashrawi.
Thank you. Good to see you. Good luck.
Good to see you.
Bye-bye.